In the smoky twilight of 1930s New York City, a strange kind of order ruled the chaos. Neon lights flickered over the wet cobblestone streets of Manhattan, where jazz spilled from speakeasies and the scent of bootleg whiskey drifted through the air. The Great Depression had hollowed out the soul of America, leaving behind desperate men and hungry dreams. Amid this fractured world, one man began to weave a new kind of empire, one that would not rely on governments or morality, but on fear, loyalty, and the precise machinery of profit. His name was Charles "Lucky" Luciano, and he would become the architect of modern organized crime. The story of Lucky Luciano is not just the tale of a gangster, it is the story of a man who understood human nature better than most politicians, businessmen, or priests of his time. He saw greed as the universal language and power as the only true currency. What made Luciano unique was not his ruthlessness, many had killed before him, but his vision. Where others saw crime as chaos, he saw it as an opportunity for order. He would take the scattered, brutal gangs that plagued New York's underworld and turn them into a syndicate, a disciplined, profitable system that mirrored the corporate world above it. The irony is haunting. While Wall Street traders dealt in stocks and steel, Luciano dealt in flesh and whiskey. Yet both systems thrived on the same principles: trust, hierarchy, and control. He was a man who blurred the boundaries between business and crime so completely that, by the time law enforcement realized what he had built, it was too late. His world had already become a shadow reflection of America's booming capitalism. But behind the myth of the powerful Don lies a deeply human story. A young immigrant from Sicily who arrived in America with nothing but ambition. A boy who learned early that survival meant understanding people, their fears, their weaknesses, their desires. Luciano mastered this craft with the precision of a surgeon. He could read a man's loyalty by the tremor of his voice, his courage by the way he held his glass, and his betrayal long before it happened. It was this psychological acuity, more than his gun or his muscle, that made him unstoppable. As the 1920s dawned, America's moral fabric began to tear under the weight of prohibition. The law said no to alcohol, but the people said yes. This contradiction became the fertile ground where Luciano's empire would bloom. Through a labyrinth of deals, bribes, and backroom negotiations, he turned illegality into industry. He was not merely a criminal. He was a strategist who understood that the greatest power lies not in violence but in organization. Yet there was always a cost. To build such an empire required betrayal, of friends, mentors, and perhaps even his own conscience. Luciano's genius was also his curse. The same ability to control and calculate left him isolated, a king in a cage of his own making. As his empire grew, so did the paranoia, the rivalries, and the shadows of law closing in. His rise would redefine organized crime, but it would also seal his fate. This documentary will explore not just the man, but the system he created, the hidden empire that reshaped America's underworld. We will trace his journey from a frightened Sicilian boy to the cold architect of the Commission, the governing body that brought business order to crime. We will step inside the smoke-filled rooms where decisions of life and death were made with the same calm efficiency as a board meeting. But more than that, this story will dive into the psychology of control, the thin line between genius and corruption, ambition and destruction. Luciano's empire was not built on brute force alone, it was built on understanding human behavior. It was a world where silence was law, betrayal was death, and money was God. Through this journey we'll uncover how Lucky Luciano's innovations outlived him, how his methods became the blueprint for organized crime around the globe. From the Mafia's golden age to the cartels and corporations of today, the echoes of his philosophy still reverberate. Structure brings power, control brings profit, and fear maintains order. As we step into his world, the line between morality and survival will blur. You may find yourself questioning not just how Luciano built his empire, but whether the world that replaced it is any different. Because in the end, this is not just a story about one man's rise to power. It is about the machinery of control that still governs us all, hidden behind the facade of legitimacy. In the next chapter we'll step back into the world before Luciano, an age of chaos, blood feuds, and unspoken codes. To understand the empire he built, we must first understand the world he inherited. A world begging for order and a young man daring enough to create it. At the turn of the 20th century, before the name Lucky Luciano carried any meaning, the underworld of New York was an untamed wilderness, a place ruled not by strategy or structure, but by instinct, blood, and survival. Immigrants poured in through Ellis Island by the millions, clutching the dream of America in one hand and the fear of starvation in the other. For many, especially the Italians and Sicilians, the promise of opportunity quickly turned into a battle for existence. In the alleys of Little Italy, where poverty was as thick as the smell of garlic and sweat, the only law that mattered was the one enforced by a blade in the dark. Before Luciano there was no mafia, as we imagine it today, no organized network, no unified leadership, no commission to arbitrate disputes. Instead, there were fragmented gangs, each bound to their own padrone or family boss, often imported from the old country. These men brought with them traditions of secrecy and revenge, relics of Sicily's feudal past where distrust of authority was bred into the bone. They called it omerta, a code of silence that demanded loyalty to one's own and contempt for the law. In the crowded tenements of New York, this code became the foundation for a brutal new ecosystem. The earliest form of Italian crime in America was known as the Black Hand. It wasn't an organization so much as a method, a form of extortion carried out by small-time thugs who preyed on their own communities. Victims would receive letters signed with a black handprint, demanding money under threat of violence or death. These were not the sophisticated criminals of the later Mafia age. They were opportunists feeding off fear, relying on superstition as much as strength. They kidnapped, murdered, and bombed their way through the immigrant neighborhoods, leaving the Italian community stigmatized and terrified. Law enforcement, often corrupt or indifferent, turned a blind eye. But the chaos extended far beyond the Italians. New York's criminal landscape was a tapestry of competing ethnic factions. Irish gangs controlled the docks and politics. Jewish gangs ruled the rackets in gambling and theft. Italians, still the newest arrivals, struggled to find their footing among them. Street corners became kingdoms and every block was a battlefield. These were the years of the Five Points Gang, the Eastman Gang, and the Gophers, names that would echo in the folklore of early organized crime. It was a world defined by violence without vision, power without permanence. The Sicilian bosses who arrived in America tried to impose the old traditions of men of honor, but America was not Sicily. In the Old World, the Mafia had thrived by manipulating a static system, an aristocracy, a church, a corrupt state that never changed. But in New York, everything moved too fast. Money flowed like blood through the streets, and the old men clinging to outdated hierarchies found themselves outmaneuvered by younger, hungrier rivals. Their power was territorial, not strategic. Each gang fought for control of neighborhoods, for slices of vice, gambling, prostitution, and protection. There was no greater vision beyond immediate survival. It was in this chaos that a silent transformation was beginning. The sons of immigrants, born in America but raised in poverty, saw opportunity in disorder. They spoke English as fluently as they did Italian. They understood the language of the streets and the systems of the city above them. They saw that crime didn't have to be local, it could be industrial. This new generation of gangsters would redefine what it meant to be a criminal in America. They weren't content to be enforcers or collectors. They wanted to be businessmen. Among them was a young boy from Sicily named Salvatore Lucania, watching the violence unfold from the sidewalks of the Lower East Side, learning the rules of a broken world. The early 1910s and 1920s were marked by brutal wars between rival Italian clans. Bosses like Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano led their men in battles that drenched New York streets in blood. Each man claimed to represent the true Sicilian tradition, yet both operated with a distinctly American hunger for dominance. They bribed cops, murdered witnesses, and turned the immigrant underworld into a theater of paranoia. These wars were unsustainable, a game of egos, not efficiency. The Mafia's potential was being wasted on petty feuds. To understand the scale of what Luciano would later achieve, one must see how fractured the world was before him. The Mafia of the early 20th century was like a body without a brain, muscle without coordination. Each family acted independently, often sabotaging one another's operations. There was no centralized leadership, no rules beyond survival. The older generation of Sicilian bosses enforced obedience through fear and tradition, but they lacked the imagination to evolve. The younger criminals were restless, eager to modernize but trapped beneath the old code. Meanwhile, American society was transforming rapidly. The First World War had ended, cities were expanding, and a new kind of wealth was emerging. The demand for vice, liquor, gambling, and women was stronger than ever. Law enforcement was fragmented, easy to bribe, and often just as corrupt as the criminals they chased. The stage was set for someone who could bring order to the chaos, someone who could merge the old world's discipline with the new world's ambition. When we look back at this period, it becomes clear that Luciano's genius was not in inventing crime but in organizing it. Before him, the underworld operated like a medieval battlefield. After him, it would resemble a corporation. The 1910s and 1920s were his classroom, and the chaos of the early Mafia was his teacher. Watching the endless feuds, the waste of money and men, Luciano learned the most important lesson of his life. Power without structure is nothing. The world before Lucky Luciano was a violent symphony of greed, pride, and confusion. But from within that noise, a single idea was forming, a vision of control, efficiency, and profit. The old bosses sought respect. The young Luciano sought results. And in the years to come, he would take that vision and reshape the very foundation of organized crime, transforming it from a patchwork of gangs into a disciplined empire. As we move forward, we step into the next phase of this transformation, the making of Charlie Luciano. To understand his power, we must first understand the boy who would one day rule over men, the immigrant who learned to turn fear into influence and poverty into empire. Salvatore Lucania was born in 1897 in Lercara Fritti, a dusty Sicilian mining town where survival was a daily negotiation. His father worked hard in the sulfur mines, earning barely enough to feed the family. The young Salvatore saw hunger, hardship, and humiliation before he could even spell his own name. When his family boarded a ship for America in 1906, they were chasing a dream shared by millions, the promise of opportunity, of dignity. But what awaited them in New York was a different kind of battlefield, one made of poverty, prejudice, and desperation. The Lower East Side of Manhattan, where the Lucania family settled, was a jungle of tenements. Families of 10 packed into single rooms, rats scurried between the walls, and disease spread faster than hope. It was a world where hard work rarely led to success. The American dream, for many, was a cruel illusion. Little Salvatore quickly learned that the streets had their own rules, rules not written in any book, but enforced by fists, knives, and sheer willpower. In the immigrant ghettos, respect was currency, and fear was the safest investment. Luciano wasn't born evil. He was born into a world where good men starved and bad men prospered. As a boy, he ran errands, shined shoes, and watched older boys shake down vendors for protection money. He admired their swagger, their fine suits, their sense of control. By age 10, he had already begun skipping school and hanging around the street corners of Hester Street, where the seeds of his future empire were quietly being planted. The early 1910s in New York were a brutal classroom for anyone who paid attention. Young Luciano did. He noticed who had power and why. He saw how the Irish gangs controlled the docks through unity and intimidation, how the Jewish kids ran clever gambling schemes, and how the Italian toughs often fought among themselves instead of cooperating. He realized early that violence alone wasn't enough, it needed direction. He began to see the underworld as a system that could be mastered rather than feared. Luciano's first steps into crime were small, running errands for local thugs, carrying messages, and later taking part in petty thefts. But unlike many others, he was never reckless. He studied people, their motives, their weaknesses. By his teenage years, he had earned a reputation as someone who could get things done quietly. He didn't crave attention like other young gangsters, he craved influence. Even his nickname, Charlie, reflected a subtle transformation, a boy trying to fit into America, shedding the immigrant label to blend into the larger world he planned to rule. He was arrested for the first time at 14 for petty theft. Most boys would have been scared straight, but Luciano saw the experience as education. Jail was a place to meet people, potential partners, mentors, and contacts. He began to understand that crime, like business, thrived on networking. Every arrest, every beating, every loss was a lesson in power. By 16, Luciano had joined the notorious 5 Points Gang, one of the most powerful criminal groups in New York at the time. The gang was a melting pot of ethnicities, Irish, Jewish, Italian, led by Johnny Torrio and Paul Kelly, two men who would shape Luciano's understanding of leadership. From Torrio, he learned the importance of organization and diplomacy. From Kelly, he absorbed the value of intellect and restraint. They taught him that killing was easy but control was art. It was during these years that Luciano formed bonds with men who would become the backbone of his empire. Frank Costello, the smooth-talking diplomat, Vito Genovese, the ruthless enforcer, and a brilliant Jewish kid named Meyer Lansky who thought like a banker but played like a criminal. The friendship between Luciano and Lansky was particularly pivotal. Where Luciano had street instincts, Lansky had mathematical precision. Together, they represented the fusion of muscle and mind that would define the Mafia's golden age. The streets hardened Luciano, but they also refined him. He learned how to dress, how to talk, how to command respect without raising his voice. He was the rare kind of criminal who could walk into a room full of cops, politicians, and gangsters, and speak their language equally well. He learned that power didn't just come from fear, it came from understanding people's desires. Money, status, respect. Everyone wanted something, and Luciano learned to trade in those currencies better than anyone. His rise wasn't without blood. He fought, stabbed, and nearly died more than once. One of the defining moments of his youth came when he was kidnapped by rival thugs, beaten, and left for dead on Staten Island. He survived barely. The newspapers called it a miracle. When he returned, his face bore scars that never healed, earning him the nickname Lucky. But the name carried more than irony, it carried destiny. He began to believe he was chosen, not by God but by fate, to rule over chaos. The psychological transformation was complete. Luciano no longer saw himself as a victim of circumstance but as its master. Every injustice he had endured, the poverty, the discrimination, the violence, became fuel. He learned to navigate both the underworld and the legitimate one, building relationships with businessmen, judges, and corrupt police. He understood that the real power didn't lie in the streets but in the boardrooms and backrooms where deals were made. By his early 20s, Luciano had graduated from a street thug into a strategist. He was already managing bootlegging routes and gambling operations, working with the likes of Arnold Rothstein, the man who fixed the 1919 World Series and arguably the first true organized criminal businessman. From Rothstein, Luciano absorbed the principle that would define his life. Crime, when managed properly, was just another form of enterprise. Every choice, every connection, every risk brought him closer to something larger. While his peers still fought over corners, Luciano was thinking about continents. He wasn't interested in running a neighborhood. He wanted to control an economy. His mind had already outgrown the streets of the Lower East Side. In the years to come, that ambition would explode into empire. But before he could build it, he needed to dismantle the old world, the aging dons clinging to their Sicilian traditions and outdated loyalties. The young Luciano was no longer the boy who feared hunger. He was the man who would feed off other people's greed. The world was changing, and Lucky Luciano was preparing to change with it, or rather, to make it change for him. What began as the story of a poor Sicilian immigrant was about to evolve into the saga of the man who would redefine organized crime itself. His rise from the alleys of New York to the boardrooms of the underworld was not just a climb through violence. It was a transformation fueled by intellect, charm, and the hunger for control. And as the roaring 20s unfolded, that hunger would find its perfect opportunity: prohibition. By the time Charlie Lucky Luciano turned 20, the streets of New York had already become his personal university, and the 5 Points Gang was his classroom. The gang was infamous not just for its violence, but for producing the generation of criminals who would go on to build the American underworld. Men like Johnny Torrio, Al Capone, Frankie Yale, and Arnold Rothstein all passed through its ranks. Luciano was one of its brightest students, though his brilliance came not from brutality but from his ability to see patterns, to recognize that crime, like business, had supply and demand, organization and hierarchy, profit and loss. The 5 Points Gang ruled the Lower East Side with precision and influence. It controlled gambling, prostitution, and protection rackets, but more importantly, it controlled people, through respect, intimidation, and economic dependence. Luciano quickly became one of the gang's trusted young lieutenants. He was efficient, calculating, and ambitious, the kind of man who didn't waste words or bullets. He learned how to delegate, how to mediate disputes, and, most importantly, how to make people work for him instead of against him. Under Johnny Torrio's mentorship, Luciano began to understand the difference between a gangster and a leader. Torrio was no ordinary street thug. He was an innovator who preferred negotiation to bloodshed and expansion to isolation. He viewed crime as an industry and believed that violence should serve profit, not pride. Luciano admired this philosophy. Torrio would later pass it to Al Capone in Chicago, but Luciano was the one who would refine it into something enduring. Through Torrio, Luciano also met Arnold Rothstein, the Jewish financier and gambler who would become his greatest teacher. Rothstein was the man who elevated organized crime from the gutter to the penthouse suite. He wore tailored suits, dealt in millions, and never carried a gun. He understood leverage and respectability. To Rothstein, crime wasn't about chaos, it was about control through intelligence. He taught Luciano how to invest, how to launder money, and how to bribe politicians without leaving fingerprints. "There's no point in being a gangster if no one can tell," Rothstein once told him, a line that Luciano would carry for life. With Rothstein's guidance, Luciano learned how to navigate between two worlds: the respectable society of bankers and politicians, and the brutal reality of the streets. He learned the value of influence, of having the right people in your pocket rather than a dozen soldiers on your payroll. Rothstein introduced him to upper-class circles, where Luciano observed that power wasn't displayed with violence but with silence. Deals were made with smiles, and betrayal came in the form of contracts, not bullets. The 1920s were roaring. Jazz filled the air, flappers danced in forbidden clubs, and America was trying to drink away its post-war anxieties. But when the U.S. government passed the 18th Amendment outlawing alcohol, they unwittingly created the single greatest business opportunity in criminal history. The Prohibition era turned street gangs into multinational enterprises overnight. And while most criminals rushed in blindly, Luciano saw something deeper. A chance to professionalize the business, to create a structure that could outlast the law itself. Before he could rise to that level, however, he had to build his own reputation. He formed partnerships with men like Frank Costello and Vito Genovese, who shared his vision of turning vice into enterprise. The trio was unstoppable: Luciano the strategist, Costello the diplomat, and Genovese the enforcer. Together, they began to organize distribution networks for bootleg liquor, establishing supply chains, securing transportation, and bribing everyone from customs officers to judges. It was crime executed with the efficiency of a Fortune 500 company. Luciano also learned how to manage alliances. He worked with Irish gangs for access to ports, Jewish syndicates for financial backing, and even with rival Italian crews when it made sense. He understood that loyalty should be transactional, not emotional. This mindset was revolutionary in a culture where the old Sicilian code of honor still dictated relationships. To the older bosses, Luciano's methods seemed disloyal. To Luciano, they were simply practical. "It's not personal," he once said, echoing a sentiment that would later define Mafia philosophy, "it's just business." The 5 Points Gang was evolving into a training ground for future kingpins, but Luciano was already thinking beyond the streets. He invested in speakeasies, gambling houses, and brothels, using his earnings to build influence. He began bribing police captains, judges, and local politicians, not just to stay out of jail but to shape the rules of the game. Where others saw law enforcement as enemies, Luciano saw them as assets. With enough money, everyone could be bought. It was just a matter of knowing their price. His transformation from street punk to businessman was deliberate. He abandoned the rough manners of his youth, adopting the polished demeanor of a New York gentleman. He wore silk suits, smoked expensive cigars, and moved through the city with the confidence of someone who understood both danger and diplomacy. His charm was disarming. He could flatter a cop, outthink a rival, or seduce a socialite with equal ease. Beneath that charm, though, was a ruthless pragmatism. He had learned that mercy was a luxury, and that survival required constant adaptation. It was during these years that Luciano also began to shape his vision of what organized crime could be. He saw how much time and money was wasted on internal wars, Italians killing Italians, each family guarding its own small patch of territory. It was senseless. If they could cooperate, they could dominate. He dreamed of a network of gangs united under a single structure, one that would regulate profits, resolve disputes, and avoid unnecessary bloodshed. In essence, he was imagining a corporate model for crime, a syndicate with rules, departments, and accountability. But that dream was still years away. For now, Luciano was sharpening his skills, building connections, and learning from every victory and defeat. The 5 Points Gang taught him how to command respect. Torrio taught him how to think long-term. Rothstein taught him how to control without being seen. These were the foundations of his empire, lessons that would later allow him to outmaneuver both gangsters and governments. The young Luciano was already walking a tightrope between ambition and danger. He had allies but also enemies, men who saw his rapid rise as a threat. The old world bosses, especially those still loyal to Sicilian traditions, viewed him with suspicion. To them he was too American, too willing to break the old rules. But Luciano didn't care. The old ways, he believed, belonged to the past. America was the future, and he was determined to own it. By the end of the decade, Luciano had become one of the most influential figures in the underworld, even if he didn't yet wear the crown. He had money, allies, and a growing reputation for intelligence and resolve. He was the link between generations, the man who understood both the language of the old dons and the ambitions of the new. In a world still governed by superstition and pride, he represented progress, a criminal who thought like a CEO. In the next stage of his journey, the opportunity of a lifetime would present itself: the Prohibition years. America's moral crusade would become Luciano's golden ticket. And as he seized it, the Mafia would transform forever, evolving from scattered street gangs into a nationwide empire. The year was 1920. America was trying to recover from the scars of World War I, but instead of peace, it found intoxication. Jazz was exploding in Harlem, the stock market was booming, and a restless generation sought pleasure to forget the horrors of the past. And then came the law that changed everything, the 18th Amendment. Prohibition had arrived. The government believed it could legislate morality, banning the sale, production, and transport of alcohol. But in trying to purify America, it accidentally created the greatest criminal gold rush in history. For men like Lucky Luciano, this was not a moral crisis, it was a business revolution. Overnight, alcohol went from being a legal commodity to contraband worth its weight in gold. People still wanted to drink. In fact, they wanted it more than ever. And the only ones capable of supplying that desire were the men willing to break the law. The underworld had just been handed its biggest opportunity. Luciano saw it immediately. Where others saw danger, he saw demand. And where there was demand, he would create supply. Prohibition transformed small-time gangsters into industrialists. But while others chased quick profits, Luciano sought sustainability. He began by forming strategic alliances, bringing together some of the most dangerous and ambitious men in New York. There was Arnold Rothstein, his financial mentor, Frank Costello, the smooth-talking political operator, Vito Genovese, his ruthless enforcer, and Meyer Lansky, his calculating partner and moral opposite. Together they were not merely bootleggers, they were the architects of a criminal corporation. They started by controlling the importation and distribution of liquor. Ships from Canada and the Caribbean were loaded with whiskey and rum, and through an intricate network of smugglers, the liquor flowed into warehouses hidden in plain sight. Trucks disguised as bakery vans or milk deliveries moved the bottles across city lines, each driver bribing police and inspectors to look the other way. Luciano didn't just want to sell alcohol, he wanted to own every step of the process, from the dock to the glass. This new empire required more than muscle. It needed coordination, discipline, and trust. Luciano brought a businessman's mind to an outlaw's trade. He divided operations into departments: transportation, distribution, enforcement, finance. Each partner managed his specialty. Rothstein handled investment and logistics. Lansky managed numbers and profit margins. Genovese oversaw discipline. Costello handled the politicians. It was the first glimpse of what would later become the Mafia Commission, a boardroom for crime. Speakeasies began to bloom across the city like neon flowers in the dark. By 1925, there were more than 30,000 of them in New York alone. They ranged from basement dives to glittering nightclubs filled with celebrities, cops, and judges sipping illegal gin. The irony was staggering. The very people who had enforced prohibition were now funding it. Money flowed in rivers and corruption became a way of life. Luciano and his partners paid off entire precincts, ensuring their trucks ran without interference. The system was so efficient that it resembled a legitimate supply chain, an illicit mirror image of corporate America. But with money came power, and with power came enemies. The Italian underworld was still divided between old-world bosses who clung to Sicilian codes and younger men like Luciano who believed in progress. The old guard despised his partnerships with Jewish and Irish criminals. To them, a true mafia man did not work with outsiders. But Luciano understood America better than they did. He knew that success in this new world required diversity, pragmatism, and innovation. "The money don't care who makes it," he once said. "So why should I?" This mindset allowed him to expand beyond the limitations of ethnicity. He worked with Irish bootleggers for distribution, Jewish syndicates for investment, and even political machines like Tammany Hall for protection. The lines between criminal and legitimate blurred completely. His empire wasn't built on violence, it was built on relationships. Luciano bribed politicians to ignore raids, paid off federal agents to leak information, and even funded police charities to gain public goodwill. He became, in essence, a businessman whose product just happened to be illegal. Yet beneath the glitz and success, the streets still ran red. The competition for control of the bootlegging trade was fierce. Rival gangs fought bloody wars over territory, supply routes, and distribution rights. Murders became routine, alliances shifted like sand. Luciano understood that survival required more than firepower, it required strategy. He often avoided unnecessary wars, preferring diplomacy over bullets. When he couldn't avoid conflict, he made sure it ended quickly and decisively. The 1920s also marked a transformation in Luciano's personal image. He no longer fit the stereotype of a gangster. He dined in fine restaurants, wore custom-tailored suits, and mingled with legitimate businessmen. He was charming, articulate, and dangerously intelligent. A man who could talk politics with a senator one moment and order a hit the next. He moved through society with disarming ease, earning the nickname Lucky, not just for surviving past ambushes, but for his uncanny ability to escape consequences. Under his guidance, the Mafia evolved from a chaotic collection of gangs into a streamlined organization. The goal was no longer survival, it was dominance. Luciano's network stretched from New York to Chicago, from Havana to New Jersey. He understood logistics on a scale few could match. Ships carried liquor from Canada to the East Coast, trucks distributed it inland, and speakeasies sold it under the glow of hidden chandeliers. He wasn't just a criminal, he was the CEO of a shadow economy. The profits were astronomical. By 1929, Luciano and his partners were making millions every year, an unimaginable fortune in those days. The money funded other ventures: gambling rings, labor racketeering, and eventually narcotics. Each new market was another stream feeding into the same ocean of profit. The empire was expanding faster than anyone had anticipated. But as the riches grew, so did the tension. Old bosses like Joe, the Boss Masuria, and Salvatore Maranzano watched the younger generation rise with suspicion and envy. They saw Luciano's modern methods as betrayal, a violation of the Sicilian way. Luciano, however, had outgrown their traditions. He wasn't interested in old country feuds or ceremonial loyalty. He wanted results. To him, the Mafia wasn't a family, it was an organization. Respect was earned through efficiency, not bloodlines. His vision was dangerous because it was rational. He wanted to turn crime into a business model, not a legacy. That philosophy would soon bring him into direct conflict with the men who still believed the Mafia should be ruled by fear and tradition. The age of Prohibition gave Luciano everything he needed: wealth, influence, and the blueprint for his future empire. It also made him a target. As his fortune grew, so did his list of enemies. But the foundation was set. The idea that crime could be managed like an enterprise, structured, disciplined, and scalable, was now reality. Lucky Luciano had taken the chaos of the underworld and given it form. What began as smuggling liquor had become something far greater: a silent revolution in the criminal world. The underworld was no longer a mob of desperate men fighting over scraps. It was a network, a business with rules, revenue, and reach. And as the decade drew to a close, Luciano was no longer just a gangster. He was a businessman of the shadows, standing on the edge of history, ready to dismantle the old Mafia and rebuild it in his own image. In the next chapter, the story turns inward, to the code that governed this world: Omerta, the ancient vow of silence that bound men together and destroyed them just as easily. The code would become both Luciano's greatest weapon and the invisible chain that would one day drag his empire down. By the early 1930s, Charles "Lucky" Luciano was no longer just a man. He was an institution. Prohibition had given birth to an empire, but it was his mind that turned chaos into structure. What the law had tried to eliminate, vice, gambling, prostitution, smuggling, Luciano transformed into industries. And just like Wall Street magnates, he diversified his portfolio. Every racket became a business venture, every territory a market, and every associate an investment. But what truly set him apart was not what he sold, it was how he managed it. Luciano's genius lay in understanding human behavior. He knew that fear could control a man for a day, but greed could control him for life. Violence was no longer his first language, it was a last resort. Instead, he spoke in profits and percentages. He wanted the men around him to see that working together was more lucrative than fighting each other. In his world, loyalty wasn't just about blood, it was about balance sheets. He was creating what the newspapers would later call the syndicate, a word that sounded less like crime and more like commerce. The syndicate was built on three pillars: gambling, labor, and unions, each feeding the other in an intricate web of money and influence. Gambling was the heart. From underground casinos in Manhattan to racetracks in Florida, Luciano and his associates like Frank Costello and Meyer Lansky turned chance into an empire. They controlled dice tables, card games, and slot machines across the country. Every bet placed, every chip exchanged, every coin dropped into a slot, some fraction of it found its way back to Luciano. Then came the unions. Luciano understood something few gangsters did. The real power in America was not in the streets, it was in the workforce. He began to infiltrate labor unions, especially the dockworkers and trucking associations. With control over unions came control over shipping routes, warehouses, and goods. A strike could cripple a company, a favor could make one flourish. Politicians, desperate to avoid disruption, were forced to negotiate. and Luciano's men always had a price. The third pillar was vice, the oldest trade of all. Prostitution had always been part of the underworld, but Luciano industrialized it. He systematized the operation, taking what had been disorganized street-level work and turning it into a network. There were managers, recruiters, collectors, and enforcers. Brothels operated under fixed schedules, and earnings were tracked meticulously. Women were treated as labor assets, an inhumane but brutally efficient approach that mirrored legitimate business practices. Each of these enterprises was interconnected. The money from gambling funded union bribes. The union power protected vice operations. The political contacts secured through bribes kept the police at bay. It was an ecosystem of corruption that sustained itself. Luciano didn't just run rackets, he created a corporate structure of crime. At the center of it all was the commission, his greatest innovation. In 1931, after the bloody Castellamarese War had claimed thousands of lives and the old bosses were dead, Luciano declared that the Mafia would never again be ruled by one supreme don. Instead, it would be governed like a board of directors. Each major family would have a seat. Disputes would be settled by vote, not bullets. And profits would be shared according to investment and territory. This system brought stability to an organization built on chaos. For the first time in American criminal history, there was peace, not because of fear but because of profit. Luciano's commission consisted of 7 powerful mafia families: the 5 families of New York, Luciano, Mangano, Gagliano, Bonanno, and Prophesai, along with representatives from Chicago and Buffalo. Together they created a national network of organized crime, operating under a unified code. Luciano's authority came not from force but from vision. He had turned the Mafia into what he called a corporation of crime. His meeting rooms looked more like business offices than gangster hangouts. Ledgers replaced street talk. Men discussed logistics and market shares. The phrase, "making money the American way," became their dark mantra. Luciano would often say, "We're not fighting for territory, we're fighting for percentage." It was a new era and he was its CEO. But the genius of Luciano's system went even deeper. He knew that visibility was death. So, he built layers of insulation. Politicians, labor leaders, union bosses, nightclub owners, all served as fronts. If law enforcement investigated a gambling ring, they would find legitimate ownership papers, licenses, and accountants. The real control was hidden behind layers of respectability. This was Luciano's innovation, turning crime into something so systemic, so embedded in society, that it became indistinguishable from legitimate business. Meanwhile, Luciano's partnership with Meyer Lansky evolved into something legendary. Lansky, the quiet strategist, handled numbers and offshore accounts, ensuring that money was laundered through banks in Cuba, Switzerland, and Panama. Together, they created one of the earliest examples of globalized crime. Money moved faster than law enforcement could trace it. By the mid-1930s, Luciano's operations had connections in Havana, Mexico City, and even Europe. But behind this success was a darker reality. For all his efficiency and structure, the business of crime was built on human suffering. Gambling destroyed lives, prostitution exploited the desperate, and labor racketeering corrupted an entire workforce. Luciano didn't see it as cruelty, he saw it as inevitability. In his mind, America was a place where everyone exploited someone. "I just play the game better," he once said. To him, crime was not rebellion, it was capitalism stripped of its illusions. The business also had another side effect: dependency. Every man in the organization depended on Luciano's network to survive. That dependency bred loyalty, but it also created silent resentment. Older mobsters, men who had earned their reputations through blood rather than business, saw him as too modern, too Americanized. They whispered that he had betrayed the Sicilian way, replacing honor with greed. Luciano ignored them, but their resentment would soon become his greatest threat. As his empire expanded, Luciano's lifestyle mirrored his success. He lived in luxury penthouses, drove imported cars, and entertained Hollywood stars. To the public he was both myth and menace. Newspapers called him the boss of bosses, though he rejected the title. "There's no boss," he insisted. "Only businessmen." But the truth was there was a boss and it was him. Every dollar of illegal revenue, every deal struck, every hit ordered, carried his invisible signature. Still, power attracts scrutiny. By 1935, law enforcement and the press began to take notice. The syndicate was too large, too organized, too efficient to ignore. District attorneys like Thomas E. Dewey were determined to bring Luciano down. But for now Luciano felt untouchable. He believed his web of influence, politicians, police captains and judges, made him invincible. He had rewritten the rules of organized crime, and America had barely realized it. The business of crime had become a science and Luciano was its chief architect. He had turned vice into an industry, loyalty into a contract, and fear into currency. His syndicate didn't just survive in the shadows, it thrived in plain sight. The underworld had evolved from gangsters with guns to executives in suits. But behind the numbers and negotiations something was shifting. The more Luciano treated crime like business, the more he distanced himself from the men who made it possible. And in a world built on loyalty, distance could be deadly. The foundation of his empire was strong, but cracks were forming. Envy, ambition, and betrayal were stirring beneath the surface. Soon, Lucky Luciano would discover that no matter how organized a crime empire became, it could never escape the chaos at its heart. His vision had changed the Mafia forever, but it would also set the stage for his greatest test, the hidden war that would determine whether the empire he built could survive the forces he unleashed. Power in Luciano's world was like fine whiskey, smooth on the surface, dangerous underneath. By the mid-1930s, Lucky Luciano had achieved something no one before him had even imagined: the complete organization of America's criminal underworld. His commission kept the peace among mafia families, profits flowed like rivers and politicians danced to his tune. But the higher he climbed, the thinner the air became. In the shadows of his empire, jealousy, ambition, and fear began to fester. Allies became competitors. Friends turned into rivals. And every alliance carried a price. Luciano's strength had always been his ability to bring people together, Italian, Jewish, Irish, under one banner of profit. Yet, the same diversity that fueled his success also sowed seeds of distrust. Many old-school mafiosi despised his openness to non-Italians. They believed the mafia should remain Cosa Nostra, our thing, exclusive and pure. To them, Luciano's friendship with Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel was not modernity, it was betrayal. The whispers grew louder. He's forgotten the old ways. He's too American. The cracks began to show. Within the commission itself, rivalry simmered. Men like Joe Prophesy and Stefano Megadino, conservative and deeply Sicilian, bristled at Luciano's pragmatic approach. Meanwhile, in Chicago, Al Capone's former lieutenants eyed the New York families with suspicion, believing Luciano was becoming too dominant. The commission that had once united the mafia was now a silent battlefield of egos. Yet Luciano, ever the strategist, believed he could balance it all. He held meetings in luxurious hotel suites, dressed impeccably, spoke softly, and exuded confidence. He could charm a senator as easily as he could command a killer. His allies, Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, and Meyer Lansky, remained his inner circle, each controlling a piece of the criminal machinery. Costello, the prime minister, handled politics and corruption. Lansky, the mathematician, ran the finances, and Genovese, the enforcer, maintained discipline with cold precision. Together they were the syndicate's brain and muscle. But not all alliances were so steady. Bugsy Siegel, Luciano's fiery protégé, embodied the next generation of gangster, bold, impulsive, and dangerously ambitious. Siegel's ventures in Los Angeles and Las Vegas promised expansion, but his reckless spending and violent temper often drew unwanted attention. Luciano admired Siegel's courage but distrusted his volatility. In the criminal world, unpredictability was a liability. Beyond his inner circle, other figures loomed, some loyal, others lurking with quiet resentment. One of them was Dutch Schultz, a volatile Jewish gangster who had made a fortune in bootlegging and numbers rackets. Schultz despised Dewey, the crusading district attorney who was building a case against him. When Schultz proposed assassinating Dewey, Luciano and Lansky immediately opposed it. Killing a prosecutor they knew would bring the full weight of the government down on them. But Schultz wouldn't listen. He ranted that Dewey would destroy everything if left alive. In one of the most pivotal decisions of his career, Luciano chose to eliminate an ally to save the system he had built. In 1935, Dutch Schultz was gunned down in a Newark restaurant, a hit sanctioned by the commission itself. The message was unmistakable: no one, no matter how powerful, could endanger the business. Luciano's empire was governed not by loyalty but by logic. That logic, however, began to erode as internal ambition grew. Vito Genovese, Luciano's right-hand man, had always admired him, but also envied him. Genovese was ruthless, calculating, and patient. Where Luciano saw partnership, Genovese saw opportunity. He began quietly building his own network, waiting for the moment when he could seize control. And when legal trouble started to close in around Luciano, Genovese would make his move. Meanwhile, law enforcement pressure was mounting. Thomas E. Dewey's campaign to clean up organized crime was gaining traction. Newspapers were filled with headlines about the Vice King of New York. Public opinion was shifting, and the image Luciano had cultivated, the polished, untouchable businessman, began to crack. Every political favor, every police bribe, every hidden deal now seemed fragile. The empire he had built on silence and control was slowly becoming a target of public outrage. Inside the underworld, fear and paranoia grew. Informants whispered about Luciano's operations, and federal agents began mapping the syndicate structure. The more Dewey exposed, the more fragile Luciano's alliances became. Men who had once been loyal began to wonder, could Luciano still protect them? Or was it time to save themselves? And then there was Frank Costello, Luciano's most trusted diplomat, who started to doubt the stability of their empire. He saw the political tides shifting, the moral panic growing. He advised Luciano to step back, to let the heat die down. But Luciano, confident and accustomed to control, refused. He believed his power was too deeply rooted to be shaken. He had bought judges, police chiefs, and even newspaper editors. He had survived worse. "They can't touch me," he said. But the walls were already closing in. At the same time, an unexpected alliance was forming between law enforcement and public morality crusaders. Church leaders, women's groups, and reform politicians began demanding a crackdown on organized vice. They targeted the one thing Luciano had always underestimated: prostitution. To the public, gambling and bootlegging had a veneer of glamour. But prostitution struck a moral nerve. The same system Luciano had organized for efficiency now became evidence of his depravity. In a cruel twist, his most organized business would become his downfall. Prostitutes, madams, and pimps who had worked under his syndicate began to testify under pressure. Police raids on brothels uncovered ledgers and payment records linking directly to Luciano's men. For years, he had hidden behind intermediaries. Now those intermediaries were turning against him. As the noose tightened, his enemies inside the commission sensed vulnerability. Some quietly cooperated with authorities, feeding information to ensure their own survival. Others, like Genovese, began positioning themselves for a power vacuum. What Luciano didn't know was that the empire he had built on logic and order was already fracturing beneath him. Still, Luciano refused to show weakness. In private he was furious. He tightened his control, ordering silence and demanding loyalty. But the whispers wouldn't stop. Every night brought new rumors, that Dewey had an informant inside the syndicate, that raids were imminent, that the next arrest could be his. The man who once commanded New York from the shadows was now being hunted in daylight. His allies were vanishing, his rivals circling, and the law closing in. What had once been his greatest strength, his ability to organize men through reason, was now his vulnerability. Because reason could be betrayed and profit could be reallocated. The alliances he had built so carefully were unraveling. The empire of friendship, greed, and fear was turning into a network of self-preservation. And in that environment, even lucky Luciano couldn't tell who was truly loyal anymore. The stage was set for the next act. A hidden war that would test not only Luciano's control over his empire but his ability to survive it. What had begun as a business was about to become a battlefield, where loyalty would be tested, betrayal rewarded, and every secret could mean life or death. By 1935, the empire that lucky Luciano had built stood like a gleaming fortress over America's criminal landscape. But beneath that gleam, something dark was festering. A silent war that would test his intelligence, his alliances, and his control. The newspapers called him the Vice King of New York, and District Attorney Thomas E. Dewey made him public enemy number one. What followed wasn't just a clash between law and crime, it was a psychological war between two visionaries who both believed they could shape the soul of America. One through justice, the other through power. Thomas E. Dewey was unlike any prosecutor Luciano had faced before. He wasn't corruptible. He wasn't afraid. He had built his reputation on efficiency, meticulous investigation, and public moral outrage. Dewey saw organized crime not as scattered gangs but as a corporate structure, something that had to be dismantled piece by piece, ledger by ledger. His approach mirrored Luciano's own logic. In many ways, Dewey was the lawful reflection of the criminal Luciano, disciplined, calculating, and relentless. Luciano had always prided himself on being 2 steps ahead. He paid off judges, greased the palms of police captains, and had a network of informants inside law enforcement itself. But Dewey changed the rules. He created a special task force of incorruptible agents who reported only to him. They raided brothels, gambling dens and warehouses across Manhattan, seizing books, interrogating madams and flipping low-level operatives. Piece by piece, they began to map Luciano's empire, the hidden connections between the syndicate's prostitution rings and its top leadership. The irony was brutal. Prohibition had made Luciano rich, the sex trade was keeping him powerful. But it was that very system, the one he had organized so efficiently, that would expose him. Dewey's men discovered that dozens of brothels across the city were paying weekly taxes to the same collectors. Those collectors, in turn, were connected to middlemen who answered to Luciano's lieutenants. The hierarchy was corporate, structured, and traceable, a business model turned into evidence. When the raids began, panic rippled through the underworld. Women who had worked under Luciano's network were arrested and interrogated. Some were beaten, others promised freedom in exchange for testimony. One by one they broke their silence. Names like Ciro Terranova, Tommy Lucchese, and Frank Costello began to surface. Eventually, the name at the top of every ledger appeared in bold: Charles "Lucky" Luciano. Luciano tried to remain calm. He knew the value of silence, the code of omerta. But this wasn't the old world anymore. Fear wasn't enough to keep mouths shut. Dewey was offering deals, protection, and something Luciano couldn't control: hope. To the people who had lived under the syndicate's shadow, Dewey wasn't just a prosecutor, he was a liberator. Still, Luciano fought back in his own way. Through Frank Costello, he pushed political allies to stall investigations, to discredit Dewey as an ambitious crusader looking for headlines. Newspapers loyal to his network began running stories accusing Dewey of fabricating evidence, of targeting immigrants, of destroying livelihoods. Behind the scenes, bribes flowed like water. Police records vanished. Witnesses recanted. For a time, it seemed the machine was working again. But Dewey wasn't just chasing Luciano, he was studying him. He anticipated every countermeasure, every attempt to silence witnesses. He realized that to take down a man like Luciano, he couldn't rely on fear or morality. He needed a spectacle. Something that would shatter the myth of Lucky Luciano, the untouchable Don who ruled from the shadows. That spectacle came in February 1936. Dewey's agents raided one of Luciano's key prostitution rings in Midtown Manhattan. They arrested more than 100 women and several of his collectors. Among them was a woman named Cokie Flo Brown, a madam who had worked within Luciano's syndicate for years. Dewey promised her protection and a new life if she testified. Her testimony, and that of others, painted Luciano as the head of a vast criminal enterprise that controlled prostitution across the city. For Luciano, the blow was devastating. He had spent years building a network so efficient it could rival a legitimate corporation, and now that very structure was being used against him. Every business meeting, every collection route, every coded phone call became a piece of evidence. In public, Luciano denied everything. He hired the best lawyers money could buy, insisted he was just a gambler, not a pimp. But privately he was furious. He saw betrayal everywhere, in his underlings, his allies, and even in his closest confidants. He suspected Genovese of leaking information, of maneuvering behind the scenes to take control if Luciano fell. Whether true or not, the paranoia consumed him. The hidden war wasn't just between Luciano and Dewey anymore, it was within Luciano's own ranks. Loyalty began to crumble. Men who had once sworn eternal allegiance were now making quiet deals with prosecutors. Luciano had always believed he could manage betrayal like business. But this wasn't business anymore, it was survival. And yet, amid the chaos, he still moved like a chess player. He relocated his meetings to hotel rooms under false names, ordered coded communications, and ensured that every order passed through 3 intermediaries. He even considered leaving New York entirely, moving operations to Havana or Mexico, where his influence still ran deep. But pride held him back. New York was his city. He had built it from the streets up. To abandon it now would be to admit defeat. Meanwhile, Dewey was closing the circle. His raids had turned into coordinated operations across the 5 boroughs. Every piece of the puzzle, gambling, unions, prostitution, led back to the same man. The newspapers began publishing stories titled, "Luciano's Vice Empire Exposed." Overnight, the myth of Lucky Luciano transformed from legend to liability. Still, for all his legal trouble, Luciano's mind remained sharp. He understood something fundamental about human nature. When people are cornered, they become unpredictable. He began playing his own psychological game. He spread rumors that certain witnesses were lying, others dead. He used his remaining loyalists to intimidate Dewey's witnesses, reminding them of the consequences of betrayal. Some recanted. Others disappeared. But Dewey's resolve never broke. He worked around the clock, building what would become one of the most famous cases in American legal history, the People v. Charles Luciano. And when the indictment finally came in June 1936, it hit like a thunderclap. Luciano was charged with 62 counts of compulsory prostitution, the legal term for pimping, and conspiracy. The king of organized crime was finally facing his reckoning. The war between Luciano and Dewey wasn't fought on streets or in alleys. It was fought in courts and headlines. It was a war of perception, of control over narrative. Luciano represented the seductive power of corruption. Dewey represented the cold, moral weight of justice. Both men were products of the same system, ambitious, intelligent, relentless. But only one could survive the story. As Luciano prepared for trial, his empire trembled. His men whispered about what would happen if he was convicted. Would the commission remain loyal? Would Genovese step in? Or would everything he built collapse into the chaos he had spent his life trying to control? The hidden war had revealed the truth that Luciano had tried to deny, that power, no matter how perfectly structured, could never truly be tamed. The system he had designed to protect him was now his cage. Every rule he had written, every hierarchy he had built, every code he had enforced, all of it was now evidence in a case that could destroy him. In the next chapter, that destruction would begin. The courtroom would become the new battlefield, and for the first time Lucky Luciano would no longer be the one giving orders. He would be the one standing trial, fighting not for power, but for his name, his freedom, and the remnants of an empire that had once seemed eternal. The trial of Charles Lucky Luciano in 1936 was more than a legal proceeding. It was a national spectacle, a morality play staged under the bright lights of New York City's most scrutinized courtroom. For years, Luciano had lived like a ghost in a tailored suit, powerful but untouchable, a man whose empire was too intricate, too invisible to destroy. But now, for the first time, the chairman of the mob was being forced to face the law, stripped of his mystique and cornered by the man who had made it his mission to bring him down, Thomas E. Dewey. From the moment the trial began in May 1936, the atmosphere was electric. Reporters packed the courtroom. Photographers waited outside to capture every smirk, every gesture, every whispered word between Luciano and his attorneys. The prosecution's case was simple but devastating: that Luciano was the chief architect behind a massive prostitution ring that stretched across New York, pulling in millions of dollars each year. Dewey's argument wasn't just about crime. It was about moral corruption, about the decay of a city that had allowed vice to masquerade as business. Luciano's defense team, led by attorney George Morton Levy, countered with style and aggression. They painted Luciano as a legitimate businessman, a gambler, yes, but never a pimp. They accused Dewey of manufacturing witnesses, of exploiting women to serve his political ambition. They emphasized the lack of physical evidence linking Luciano directly to the brothels. "There is not a single piece of paper with my client's name on it," Levy thundered before the jury. "Not a single witness who ever took an order from him directly." But Dewey had something stronger than paper. He had people. One by one, women who had worked within the prostitution network took the stand. Many were visibly frightened, some trembled as they spoke. But their stories were strikingly consistent. They described a system that operated like a corporation. Weekly quotas, collections, punishments for disobedience. The madams took orders from collectors, the collectors answered to middlemen, and at the top of the pyramid stood Luciano. The most damaging testimony came from Cokie Flo Brown, a madam with deep connections to the syndicate. Her voice was steady but filled with bitterness as she recounted meetings, names, payments, and the coded language used to conceal transactions. "Everyone knew who the boss was," she said, her eyes darting toward Luciano. "We didn't say his name, but we knew." Luciano sat motionless, his expression a mask of control. But inside he seethed. He had survived beatings, betrayals, and bloody wars on the streets, yet here he was, being undone not by rivals but by women he barely knew. He felt trapped, humiliated. The empire he had built with precision and secrecy was being dismantled in front of strangers, reduced to a series of sordid stories that made headlines each morning. Despite the overwhelming testimony, Luciano's defense fought fiercely. They discredited witnesses as drug addicts and opportunists, women seeking leniency in exchange for lies. They argued that Dewey's crusade was driven not by justice but by ambition, that he was using Luciano's trial as a stepping stone to political glory. In a sense, they weren't wrong. Dewey's pursuit of Luciano made him a national hero. The public saw him as the face of reform, the man who had finally tamed the underworld. But the facts were hard to ignore. Dewey presented ledgers, phone records, and the testimony of Luciano's own collectors, who confirmed that money from brothels was funneled upward to the higher echelons of the organization. While Luciano's name never appeared on the documents, the structure of the operation mirrored his corporate model so perfectly that it was impossible to believe he wasn't involved. As the trial stretched into June, the tension deepened. Luciano's confidence began to falter. He had believed that his influence, his money, and his allies could protect him. But Dewey's team had insulated itself from bribery and intimidation. Every avenue of manipulation Luciano had once used was now closed. He was trapped within a system he couldn't corrupt. When Dewey finally delivered his closing argument, it was nothing short of theatrical. His voice was calm but powerful, resonating through the packed courtroom. This man, Charles Luciano, believes he can by the law, that he can own the city, that he can profit from human misery without consequence. But no man, no matter how powerful, is beyond the reach of justice. The words echoed through the chamber. Dewey wasn't just speaking to the jury, he was speaking to the nation. After nearly 2 days of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict: guilty on all 62 counts. The room fell silent. Luciano, expressionless, stood as the judge sentenced him to 30 to 50 years in prison, one of the harshest penalties ever handed down for organized vice in American history. For a man who had once ruled New York's underworld like a monarch, it was a stunning fall. Reporters described the scene vividly: Luciano walking out of the courtroom in silence, his head held high but his eyes dark with fury. The empire he had built, the alliances, the networks, the careful structure of power, was collapsing in real time. His men scattered. Some fled the city, others switched allegiance to Vito Genovese, who quickly began maneuvering to take control in Luciano's absence. Yet even in defeat, Luciano's legend only grew. To the public, he became the ultimate symbol of crime's glamour and decay, the gangster who lived like a king but fell like a man. To the underworld, he remained a myth, a name spoken in whispers, proof that no one, not even Lucky Luciano, was truly untouchable. Behind the cold stone walls of Dannemora prison, Luciano began a new chapter. Stripped of his empire, he still carried something that no sentence could take away: his mind. He would use it again, reshaping his legacy from the shadows. The trial had broken his freedom, but not his influence, and soon the world would learn that even from a prison cell, Lucky Luciano's story was far from over. Luciano's conviction in 1936 was not the end of his story, it was the beginning of an entirely new war fought from behind iron bars. His sentencing sent shockwaves through both the criminal underworld and the political establishment. Newspapers called it the death of the American Mafia, a phrase that now sounds almost naive. In truth, Dewey's victory only forced the Mafia to evolve, to grow smarter, more secretive, and even more disciplined. And at the heart of this evolution, ironically, was the very man serving a 30 to 50-year sentence inside one of New York's most forbidding prisons, Charles "Lucky" Luciano. He was sent first to Sing Sing, then later transferred to Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, a cold fortress perched near the Canadian border, nicknamed Little Siberia for its brutal winters. The cells were cramped, the walls damp, the air perpetually heavy with the scent of iron and disinfectant. For most inmates, Dannemora was a place where ambition died. But Luciano was not like most men. Even stripped of luxury, he carried himself like a boss. Guards would later recall how he walked the corridors as though they were the marble halls of a Manhattan hotel, slow, deliberate, unbending. Prison was not kind to the body, but it sharpened the mind. Luciano spent his early days studying reports about organized labor, supply chains, and logistics, anything that could teach him how legitimate businessmen maintain control over vast, complex systems. He once told a fellow inmate, "The difference between me and them is paperwork." In that line lay the philosophy that had always defined him. Control is not about violence, it's about systems. Still, Luciano understood that control required connection. Though physically isolated, he began to rebuild his communication network, using lawyers, guards, and visitors as his conduits. Slowly, information began to flow in and out of Dannemora. Orders were disguised as legal correspondence or casual messages, coded so cleanly that even when intercepted, they seemed meaningless. Through these invisible channels, Luciano managed to maintain a surprising degree of influence over his old organization. Outside, the world he had built was shifting. Vito Genovese, once his trusted lieutenant, was angling for dominance. Genovese moved quickly to consolidate power, exploiting Luciano's absence to claim territory and manipulate the remaining bosses. But his reign was brief. Facing his own criminal charges, Genovese fled to Italy. Into that vacuum stepped Frank Costello, the prime minister of the underworld, a man of calm intelligence and business acumen. Costello ruled through negotiation and strategy, preserving the commission Luciano had designed. In essence, the machine kept running, even without its creator. Inside Dannemora, Luciano watched these developments with a mix of pride and frustration. The commission still functioned as he intended, but the lack of his direct oversight made it unstable. Some members grew ambitious, others paranoid. The Mafia was becoming less about unity and more about personal gain. For a man who had always believed in structure above all, it was painful to witness. In 1942, the world beyond prison walls was burning. The Second World War had consumed Europe, and America's east coast faced an invisible enemy: German submarines that hunted merchant ships, sinking them within sight of New York's harbors. The American government, desperate to secure its ports, turned to an unlikely ally: organized crime. Intelligence agencies believed the Mafia controlled much of the dock labor, and that its cooperation could prevent sabotage and gather information about enemy activity. Operation Underworld was born, a covert partnership between the U.S. Navy and the mob. But the operation needed someone who could command obedience across all Mafia families, someone with influence that extended from New York to Sicily. There was only one name that fit that description: Lucky Luciano. The request was unthinkable, a government turning to a convicted mob boss for help. But war has a way of erasing moral boundaries. Through intermediaries, Navy intelligence officers reached out to Luciano's attorney. They offered him a deal: cooperation in exchange for consideration toward early release. Luciano agreed, not out of patriotism but calculation. This was his opening, a chance to transform his image, to turn himself from villain to asset. Within months, Luciano's influence began to ripple through the docks. Sailors stopped disappearing, sabotage ceased, and information from Sicilian contacts flowed back to Allied commanders. Some historians dispute how effective Luciano's assistance truly was, but the perception was powerful. In the eyes of the U.S. government, he had become useful. By 1945, with the war nearing its end, officials quietly arranged a review of Luciano's sentence. Governor Thomas Dewey, ironically the same man who had prosecuted him, approved the recommendation for clemency. Dewey reasoned that Luciano's cooperation had aided national security, though he maintained that his continued presence in the United States is undesirable. It was a carefully worded statement. Dewey freed him, but with exile attached. In February 1946, after 9 years behind bars, Lucky Luciano walked out of prison for the last time. He looked older, his hair streaked with gray, his eyes more tired, but the aura of command remained. Crowds gathered outside, reporters shouting questions, flashbulbs bursting like gunfire. Luciano said little. His destination was already decided. He would be deported to Italy, the country of his birth, never to legally return to the United States again. The irony of his release was not lost on him. The same system that had condemned him had now set him free, not through justice but through convenience. He had played the long game and won, not the battle but survival itself. As the ship carrying him across the Atlantic cut through the waves, Luciano stood on the deck, smoking in silence. Behind him lay the city he had ruled. Ahead lay a homeland he barely remembered. He had outsmarted his enemies, outlasted his sentence, and preserved his myth. But in the depths of his mind, he must have sensed what awaited him: exile, loneliness, and the slow unraveling of everything he had once controlled. Still, as the Statue of Liberty faded into the horizon, there was no trace of regret on his face. He had built an empire from the gutter, commanded kings of crime, and even forced the U.S. government to need him. For a man like Lucky Luciano, that was the truest definition of power, one that not even a prison cell could erase. When Charles Lucky Luciano arrived in Italy in 1946, the world outside had changed beyond recognition. The empires of Europe lay in ruins, America was basking in post-war triumph, and the global order had shifted dramatically. But for Luciano, the change ran deeper. He was no longer the king of New York, no longer the man who commanded the American Mafia with the snap of his fingers. He was an exile, a foreigner in the land of his birth. And yet, even from thousands of miles away, the underworld still whispered his name with respect and fear. His deportation to Italy was meant to neutralize him. A neat political solution that allowed America to claim victory without inviting scandal. But power is rarely constrained by geography. In Naples, where he eventually settled, Luciano's influence began to seep quietly back into the bloodstream of organized crime. The port city was teeming with opportunity, smuggling routes, black markets, and desperate men willing to work for anyone who offered them a taste of profit. Luciano immediately recognized the potential. Italy, battered and hungry, was the perfect environment for a rebirth. At first, he lived quietly in an apartment near the harbor, keeping his movements discreet. American agents stationed in Europe kept him under surveillance, convinced he would attempt to rebuild his empire. They weren't wrong. Though he could no longer set foot in the United States, Luciano began to re-establish communication with his old allies, Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky, and others who had kept the machinery running in his absence. Through coded letters, couriers, and trusted intermediaries, he began to advise, mediate, and even arbitrate disputes among mob families back in the States. Prison had taught Luciano patience, and exile refined it into strategy. He no longer sought the spotlight, he preferred the shadows. His power came not from physical presence but from perception. To the Mafia's next generation, men like Carlo Gambino and Joseph Bonanno, he was a living legend, a mythical founder figure whose rules and vision had defined their world. The commission he created continued to govern the families, and even those who had never met him followed his principles: stability, structure, and business before bloodshed. In the late 1940s, Italy itself became fertile ground for Luciano's new ventures. The post-war black market was booming, cigarettes, liquor, and American consumer goods were smuggled by the ton. Luciano quietly invested in these operations, partnering with Neapolitan and Sicilian intermediaries. One of his closest associates, a man named Enrico Nicoletti, later claimed that Luciano helped organize a transatlantic smuggling network moving American cigarettes into Europe, an enterprise so profitable it was nicknamed the White Gold Rush. It was, in many ways, the same business model Luciano had built decades earlier: structured, disciplined, and ruthlessly efficient. But beyond the smuggling and the profits, Luciano's role took on a deeper, almost philosophical significance. He began to see himself as a mentor, a custodian of a legacy. Younger mobsters from Sicily and Naples sought his counsel, eager to learn from the man who had turned crime into an institution. He taught them the importance of order, of keeping internal wars to a minimum, of treating the Mafia like a multinational company rather than a street gang. "Violence is for amateurs," he reportedly said. "Business is for professionals." Yet, beneath this calm exterior, Luciano was not immune to the ache of loss. Exile, no matter how gilded, is still a prison. He missed New York, the rhythm of its streets, the skyline at dusk, the familiar scent of cigars and whiskey in backroom meetings. He had once ruled that city like a silent monarch, but now he was a ghost watching from afar. His letters to friends often carried a tone of melancholy. "I got everything I ever wanted," he wrote to Lansky, "except the one thing that matters, being there." Still, Luciano found ways to remain relevant. When American intelligence agencies began to worry about communist infiltration in post-war Italy, Luciano's name surfaced again. His wartime collaboration with U.S. intelligence had not been forgotten, and some within the government believed he could again serve as a quiet intermediary, someone capable of influencing the volatile criminal networks that overlapped with Italy's fragile politics. Whether this collaboration actually happened remains debated by historians, but the idea itself speaks volumes. Even in exile, Lucky Luciano remained indispensable. By the early 1950s, he had settled into a strange rhythm, half businessman, half ghost. He frequented the Grand Hotel Et de Palms in Palermo, a place steeped in old-world charm and quiet corruption. There, in dimly lit lounges, he met with figures from both sides of the Atlantic. It was at this hotel, many believe, that he helped facilitate the early connections between American mobsters and the emerging Sicilian Mafia, relationships that would later fuel the global heroin trade. The irony was cruel. Luciano, who had once insisted on keeping narcotics out of Mafia business, now found his name entangled in it. The French Connection, the infamous drug network that moved heroin from Europe to America, was often traced back to operations that began under his watch. Whether he actively sanctioned the trade or simply turned a blind eye remains uncertain, but the damage to his reputation was irreversible. The old guard saw him as tainted, a man whose empire had drifted from discipline into moral decay. As the years passed, Luciano's power became more symbolic than practical. Younger bosses no longer needed his approval to act. They operated in a world he had designed, but one that no longer answered to him. He had become, in a sense, a relic of his own creation, respected, feared but increasingly irrelevant. His health began to fail. He suffered from heart problems, insomnia, and constant paranoia that the Americans or Italians would one day drag him back into court. Yet, despite his isolation, Luciano never lost the aura of control. When visitors came to see him, he remained immaculate: sharp suits, polished shoes, a cigarette always between his fingers. He spoke softly, measuredly, as if every word was part of a final performance. Those who met him in these later years often described a strange duality, a man both at peace with his past and haunted by it. One of his associates once asked him if he regretted the life he'd led. Luciano reportedly smiled and said, "If I hadn't done it, someone else would have. I just did it better." In 1959 he began working on a memoir with journalist Martin Gosch, hoping to tell his story on his own terms. It was part confession, part justification, part warning. In it, he claimed that his goal had always been to bring peace and order to a chaotic world, to make crime rational. "We made the world run smoother," he said. "We just did it outside the law." By the early 1960s, Lucky Luciano was living quietly in Naples, occasionally meeting old friends, always watched by police and spies. He was older now, heavier, but the legend still glowed faintly around him. The man who had built an invisible empire, who had turned street gangs into corporations, now lived in a small apartment overlooking the bay, an emperor without a throne, but still a king in his own mind. Soon fate would close in once more. Not with a gun, not with betrayal, but with time itself, the one enemy even Lucky Luciano couldn't outmaneuver. His final chapter was about to begin, and it would end as it began, in quiet shadows surrounded by whispers of power. After years of ruling from the shadows, Lucky Luciano's empire finally began to crumble under the weight of law, betrayal, and time. His deportation to Italy in 1946 marked the true end of his reign, not with violence or execution but with exile. For a man who had once commanded the underworld of New York, being forced from American soil was the cruelest punishment imaginable. Yet even in exile, Luciano remained a figure of fascination and quiet influence. In Naples he lived modestly but never anonymously, his presence still commanding respect among those who remembered his power. Though stripped of his formal authority, Luciano never fully surrendered his instinct for control. He maintained connections with allies in the United States and sought to rebuild influence through new ventures, including suspected drug operations and black market dealings, though he denied involvement until his death. He met frequently with old associates who still referred to him as the boss, even if only out of reverence for his legacy. But the golden age he had created was gone. The new generation of mobsters lacked his discipline, and the empire he once kept in order was fragmenting into greed and violence. In those final years, Luciano's reflections grew heavier. Friends recalled him spending hours looking out over the Bay of Naples, talking about his youth in New York, the poverty, the ambition, the betrayals. There was nostalgia in his voice but also regret. He had built everything he ever dreamed of, yet ended up alone, exiled, and haunted by the system he created. When he died of a heart attack in 1962, waiting to meet a film producer about telling his life story, it felt almost poetic, the final act of a man whose legend would outlive him. Luciano's exile and death closed the chapter on the original American Mafia, but his methods endured. The commission he established still governed mob activity for decades, and his organizational structure became the model for criminal enterprises around the world. In exile he had lost his empire, but in legacy he became immortal. Lucky Luciano's end was quiet, but his influence echoed louder than ever, proving that even in defeat, the architect of the Mafia's golden age never truly vanished. Lucky Luciano's death marked the end of an era, yet his influence continued to echo long after his heart stopped in that Naples airport. His name became more than history, it became a symbol, a brand, and a myth that defined how the world understood organized crime. The empire he created, the structure he designed, and the discipline he enforced became the foundation upon which the global underworld still operates. From the American Mafia to the Sicilian Cosa Nostra and beyond, his blueprint for control, through organization, alliances, and balance, remains unmatched. But Luciano's true legacy lies not only in the underworld he built, but in how he blurred the boundaries between crime and commerce. He was one of the first to treat the Mafia as a corporation, with territories as markets, soldiers as employees, and loyalty as its currency. Even law enforcement eventually learned to mirror his methods, forming task forces, hierarchies, and communication channels that reflected the same efficiency he had pioneered in secrecy. Despite his exile and downfall, Luciano's name retained a strange reverence among those who came after him. To some, he was a villain who corrupted cities and destroyed lives. To others, he was a visionary who imposed logic and order on chaos. He showed that power is not about brutality but about influence, about knowing when to strike and when to stay silent. In the decades that followed, the world saw echoes of Luciano's philosophy in every organized system of power, criminal or legitimate. His life became a cautionary tale and a manual at once, proof that structure can elevate anyone, but that no empire, no matter how cunningly designed, can escape decay. Lucky Luciano may have died in exile, but the world he built never truly vanished. His shadow still lingers, in boardrooms, backrooms, and every quiet deal where power is traded for loyalty. In the end, Lucky Luciano's story is more than a chronicle of crime, it's a portrait of ambition, control, and the price of power. He began as a poor immigrant boy in New York, chasing survival in a world that offered little mercy. Through intellect, strategy, and a cold understanding of human nature, he built an empire that would outlive him. But his empire was not made of bricks or borders, it was built on loyalty, fear, and structure. Luciano turned chaos into order and crime into business, reshaping the underworld forever. Yet his success carried a curse. The very system he built, one founded on discipline and silence, eventually consumed itself. Betrayal replaced loyalty, greed replaced strategy. Even as he aged in exile, Luciano knew that power never truly belongs to anyone, it only passes through their hands. His exile in Naples symbolized that truth, the king without a throne, the mastermind forgotten by the world he once ruled. And still his shadow endures. From New York's criminal history to modern organized networks across the globe, the blueprint Luciano designed continues to operate. Governments, corporations, and even intelligence agencies have studied his methods. The delegation of power, the illusion of unity, the business behind crime. In the end, Luciano's legacy is not one of violence but of understanding how power functions, how it seduces, corrupts, and defines. He remains the paradox of the American dream, the man who conquered the system by breaking it, and who proved that control, once gained, always demands a greater price.